Hello and good morning and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, the 108th in the series. Good morning, John. Doing my usual wait for a wee second until I can see people joining us. So welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. As I say, this is the 108th in the series, and this week we are looking at the subject of the Lovat Scouts. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres across the Highlands of Scotland. We have the Highland Archive and Registration Centre in Inverness. We have Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick, Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, and Skye and Lochalsh Archive Centre in Portree. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that. And I'm aware that many of you have done so over the past 2 years. So thank you again sincerely for that. It really does make a difference to us. Nice to see everybody saying hello. Glad you've all got nice sunny weather. Okay, so this week we are following on, carrying on our theme of on the move. So we've looked at various different things of people travelling for work, for pleasure, and so on. And this week we're going to look at a subject which led to the mass movement of many Highlanders, for many of them for the first time. And this is the story of the Lovat Scouts. It's something which I'm sure some people will have stories to share in the comments. It's something that we have some pride for in the Highlands, the Lovat Scouts. Now, we hold various references to the Lovat Scouts in our collections, and I'll touch on some of those as I go through this loose timeline. A proviso before I start, this is one maybe some of you, if you've been watching regularly, will be expecting me to say, and this is, I am not a military historian. Any regiment, battalion, unit that has a long history will have gone through numerous iterations with disbandments, reformations, different being squadrons, units, battalions, regiments. So please do have some patience with me as I try to give a summary of the Lovat Scouts without going into that vast military detail. So first of all, who are the Lovat Scouts? What's their story? Why were they formed in the first place? Well, I wanted to start by sharing some extracts from a book called The Story of the Lovat Scouts, 1900 to 1980, which was written by Michael Leslie Melville, who was one of the Lovat Scouts. And so I wanted to start by giving some background from that book. It opens with these lines. Simon Joseph, 16th Lord Lovat and 22nd Chief of Clan Fraser of Lovat, KT, GCVO, KCMG, CB, DSO. So lots of letters and initials and designations after his name. He raised the Lovat Scouts early in the year 1900 to fight in the South African War. The very existence of this regiment was the result of his imagination, enthusiasm, and leadership. No history of the Scouts should therefore begin without a brief account of this great Highland chief and man of action, and particularly of his early life and training, which were to have such a profound effect on later events. That introduction to Lord Lovat himself goes on to describe Lovat's passion for the outdoors, for sports, for the hills, the landscape of the Highlands, military service, and horses, all of which would become central and vital to the story of the Lovat Scouts. Why was a new regiment needed? That mentions being raised for the fight in South Africa. Why was there a fight in South Africa? And I was interested last week to see that we had viewers from Pretoria in South Africa. I'm not sure if you're there this week, but I'd be interested to hear your take on this subject. Because like all wars, there's a long story before it. There's a long build-up to any conflict and a complex story usually. And also, as you'll all be familiar, those stories change over time. That the concept and the understanding of why conflict happens changes over time as well. But here is the summary from that book, The History of the Lovat Scouts, that gives their understanding as of 1980, when the book was published, of why the war in South Africa was happening and why the Lovat Scouts were needed. And it reads like this. The Lovat Scouts were not raised until 3 months after the outbreak of the Boer War, but it is relevant to consider briefly, even at the risk of oversimplification, the causes of the war and its disastrous opening phase. The Boers, which means farmers in Dutch, came to South Africa as long ago as 1652, when the Dutch East India Company founded a settlement on the southern Cape. It soon became a thriving community of Cape Colony. It changed hands between the Dutch and the British several times until finally Britain paid £6 million for it in 1815, largely to ensure her route to India. The Boers hated British rule. In the next few years, about 10,000 of them made the great trek north to create their own farming and ranching country of Orange Free State. From there, some trekked eastwards over the Drakensberg Mountains into Natal, and others pushed on northwards to found the Transvaal Republic between the Vaal and the Limpopo rivers. When Britain successfully annexed Natal in 1843, many Boers fled westwards. In 1852 and 1854, Britain officially recognised the two Boer republics of Orange Free State and Transvaal, but did not give them complete independence. And the Boers were never happy with this arrangement, and there was constant friction, including a 3-month war in 1881, known as the First Boer War, which ended in the somewhat vague Treaty of Pretoria. When gold was discovered near Johannesburg, sudden wealth came to the Transvaal, but with it a great influx of foreigners, the Uitlanders. Determined to keep control of their own country, the Boers taxed these foreigners heavily, but did not give them full rights of citizenship. In 1895, the Uitlanders appealed to Britain for help, and when this was refused, they contemplated an armed rising. Cecil Rhodes, the then Prime Minister of British Cape Colony, offered to support the Uitlanders by sending a small party of mounted police under Dr. Jameson, who would ride into the Transvaal once the revolt broke out. Although the Uitlanders called off their proposed rebellion, Dr. Jameson unfortunately continued with his raid, which proved a fiasco. He was ambushed, he lost 30 men, and he soon found himself with the rest of his party in Pretoria jail. This unhappy incident served only to infuriate the Boers and to increase both their mistrust of Britain and their determination to gain total independence for their two republics, Transvaal and Orange Free State. In March 1899, the Uitlanders again asked Britain to intercede for them. A meeting between President Kruger of the Transvaal and the British High Commissioner Sir Alfred Milner ended in failure. Tension mounted, and on the 8th of October, President Kruger and President Stein of the Orange Free State issued an ultimatum to Britain. It included demands that Britain should give up all control over the two republics, should withdraw troops from the Transvaal border, and remove all reinforcements from South Africa. If the conditions were not met by the 5 p.m. on the 11th of October, both republics would regard this as a declaration of war. No one imagined that these terms would be agreed to, but few British people thought that the resultant war would last as long or be such a serious problem to the Empire. The Times humorously reported on the 11th of October that war had broken out at about tea time. The joke proved to be out of place. The South African War was to become Britain's greatest conflict since the time of Napoleon. It lasted nearly 3 years, cost £222 million, and involved roughly 450,000 Imperial troops, of whom 22,000 died, nearly 3/4 of them, from disease. The Boer armies amounted to at most 88,000 irregular soldiers. They boasted no uniform save their dark homespun working clothes and slouch hats. They often provided their own horses and weapons, but above all, they were acclimatized to the country in which they were fighting. And as I say, I wanted to read all of that because it gives the understanding of from the regiment's point of view of why the war had happened and why we were in South Africa at all fighting. Once again, our empire coming to bite us. And I mean that in that our own reputation with our empire is so awkward and so uncomfortable to us today. So that's how that kind of situation built and why we ended up in conflict in South Africa. Why then were the Lovat Scouts needed? We had a British Army. Why were the Lovat Scouts specifically required? Well, the book goes on to say, Britain as a nation was gradually rising in wrath. In 2 months into the war, she had suffered 3,000 casualties and a series of humiliating defeats. As usual, some people blamed politicians, others, rightly or wrongly, criticised the generals. But there was an understanding that there was change needed and that the British Army as it existed was not suitable and appropriate for fighting this type of conflict. And that key sentence there was the fact that the Boers were acclimatised to the conditions in which they were fighting, and the British Army simply wasn't. So they say other changes were needed, changes in outlook, in method, and in tactics. The British Regular Army, although magnificently disciplined and courageously led, was no match for this elusive army, with his superior use of speed and surprise, and his far greater ability in fieldcraft, reconnaissance, and marksmanship. No one knew this better than Lord Lovat. He admired the skill and the fighting qualities of the Boers, but he had complete faith in the Highland countrymen amongst whom he had been brought up. He believed that their natural ability at spying, stalking, and shooting could be trained and led to help in defeating the Boers at their own game. He felt certain that he could raise such a body of men, and that with all his determination and charm, his gifts of leadership, and his personal influence with important people, he set about making this vision a reality. He approached the war on the 12th of December, 1899. After a fortnight's delay, he received permission to raise one, if not two, companies, primarily for scouting purposes, to be attached to the Black Watch. After a meeting in Inverness with some Highland proprietors and the officers of the 1st Battalion Cameron Highlanders, it was decided to raise two companies, one of mounted infantry and the other on foot. To give effect to the idea primarily for scouting, of the 236 men in the two companies, up to 80 were to be chosen with stalking ability as their first qualification. The remainder were to be selected with special regard to marksmanship, stamina, military service, and riding, and were to include the necessary number of trained signallers, shoeing smiths, and craftsmen. Of the 10 officers to be chosen, 5 were to have had previous military experience abroad, and the others to have had some training with the volunteers. So you can see there that Lord Lovat saw there a gap in the market, if you will. He saw that in order to fight the Boers, and as I say, we'll put aside the whole issue of the right and wrong of the conflict in the first place, but in order to more accurately and fight in South Africa, he saw that there was a new set of skills needed, and that the skills that were needed matched the skills that were so well embodied by the hillsmen in the Highlands. Now, we hold, of course, so far I've talked from that book, but we hold various family and estate collections across our offices, and these can take us, as you'll have seen so many times over the past 2 years in these sessions, they can take us from the general to the particular. So the book tells us that Lovat set about raising the Lovat Scouts. Our collections then can take us right to an exact example of that. We hold in our collections the Fraser Tytler papers, and we have in that collection a letter written by Lovat to Edward Grant Fraser Tytler on the 4th of January 1900, so just a couple of weeks after Lovat had received permission to raise the Lovat Scouts. And this is a letter, an individual example of that rallying call to raise troops. And this is this letter written by Lovat to Fraser Tytler, Aldowrie. Beaufort Castle, Beaulieu, January 1900. Dear Aldowrie, I have been authorised by the War Office to raise a corps of 150 stalkers, gillies and picked men for primarily scouting service in South Africa. At a meeting at the club in Inverness yesterday, Wednesday the 3rd of January, it was unanimously resolved to ask you to assist in the recruiting of any suitable men in the district of Stratherick. The terms of service are as follows: enlistment for 1 year or the conclusion of the war, if sooner. Pay, allowances and bounties the same as for troops on active service. The corps is to be attached to the Black Watch for pay and rations, etc., and to be commanded by Highland officers and to be sent out to the port as soon as possible. I enclose forms of enlistment which I would be obliged if you could fill in for any man wishing to join and forward to Colonel Fergus McNeill, 13 Lombard Street, Inverness. On receipt of the enlistment paper at Inverness, the candidate's name will be inscribed on a roll and a day appointed on which he will be inspected at one of the following centres at the candidate's option, either at Inverness, Kingussie, Fort William, Dingwall, Lairg, Perth or Oban. As it is essential to ensure the best stamp of men with all possible dispatch, I would be much obliged if you could see your way to send for some of the most likely men in your district and to acquaint them with the scheme in order that they may have both the opportunity of judging for themselves and also of acquainting others of what is afoot. In the event of you being yourself unable to attend to this matter, could you delegate a friend, factor, or suitable person to undertake this work without further authority? I may add that of the proprietors as yet written to, the very great majority have offered to keep places vacated open, so if the men do take up their role, their jobs are kept for them. Many have promised to help pay the difference in wages, and none have offered to put any difficulties in the way. Any technical difficulty will at once be looked into by Colonel McNeill, and telegrams to me at Beaufort, Beaulieu will at once be forwarded and attended to. In conclusion, it has been reported in the papers that the men of this corps are to be all stalkers, that they are all to be mounted, and that the officers are already chosen. All of these facts are incorrect. The men are to be as far as possible hillmen with some good shots and signallers. Only a part of the corps can possibly be mounted, and the choice of officers lies entirely with the War Office and is not yet settled. Again, requesting your aid, I remain yours truly, Lord Lovat. So we can see there that an exact example of Lovat writing to these to the landowners and saying, we need men who know the hills, who know how to scout in the hills effectively. Please encourage people to sign up for this. Now, application levels were very high, and in January 1900, the men had been selected at those various recruiting stations and were mobilised at Beaufort at the seat of Lord Lovat for 7 weeks of training. The first commanding officer was Major Andrew Murray of the 1st Cameron Highlanders, and officers included Lord Lovat, Edward Grant Fraser Tytler, who that letter was written to, William Theodore Fraser Tytler, Brodie of Brodie, and various others. And it was very interesting as I was looking through some of this correspondence that it was understood that there was an importance that if they wanted the Highland, the gillies and the men to sign up, that they needed to be commanded by Highland commanders as well, that there was a real local feel to this, that this is something that the Highlands was doing together at all levels of the organisation, from Lovat down. Now, one of the collections we hold at the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness, which we have very recently finished cataloguing, and I'm excited to mention it to you, is the Lovat Estate Collection, a large, substantial collection of letter books and other items relating to the management of the Lovat estates. And these letter books contain some really interesting insights into the story of the Scouts and the very close relationship between them and Lord Lovat, the estate and the family. And it is so closely linked, and that is very apparent when you look through this collection, that the Lovat Scouts, yes, they're an official regiment, they're part of the army, they're doing a job for the state, for the government, but they're very close link with Lovat himself, with the Lovat estates, and the family. For instance, Anne, yes, I'm seeing your question there about the reference. I'll give that to you at the end. For instance, these letter books contain a letter dated the 19th of January 1900, so again, very soon after Lovat's got permission from the War Office to raise the Scouts. A letter written by Mr. Garriach, who was the Lovat Estates factor for some 40 years. And he's writing to Alexander Monroe, tailor in Fort Augustus, and it reads like this. Imagine how you would feel if you were the tailor getting this letter. Dear Sir, about 500 khaki Norfolk jackets and over 200 pairs of knickerbockers with straps are required for Lord Lovat's Corps of Scouts. The material and the buttons for the jackets will be supplied. Please send on receipt an offer addressed to Sir John Edward, Baronet, Orderly Room 13, Lombard Street, Inverness, stating what you are prepared to make a pair of knickerbockers and a Norfolk jacket for, and how many of each you could supply within 10 to 14 days from the date of receiving the material. Extraordinary. The average height of the men is from 5'8" to 5'11". The chest measurement is between 35 and 41 inches, and the majority measure 35 to 38. The Norfolk jackets will have belt and four pockets outside with flaps. The knickerbockers will be of plain khaki, and the jacket of khaki serge. So you can see there that the estate and the Lovat, the factor of the Lovat estate, is personally involved in writing letters about clothing the Lovat Scouts. And apparently their outfits went on to have a splash of Fraser tartan sewn on for those very initial group of men, Fraser tartan sewn on by members of the Lovat family and friends. Interestingly, though, their clothes continued to play a really important part in the story of the Scouts, and they went on to be the first military unit ever to wear a ghillie suit. So that's that sort of camouflaged moving outfit that looks like it's covered in leaves. So a first for the Lovat Scouts, and they went on to have several firsts. So that's, you can see the estate's involvement there in clothing the Scouts. Other items were sourced in a variety of different ways. Donations of ponies by estates, collections of money to purchase telescopes and other items. And again, the letter books detail this. There are letters of thanks, including to the Earl and Countess of Leven in Roehampton and various others, thanking them for their donations towards the Scouts, whether that is financial donations or donations of, as I say, ponies, telescopes, things that they would need in South Africa. After those weeks of training at Beaufort Castle, the Scouts set off for South Africa. And a letter by the estate factor to Miss Fraser in Italy describes their departure. This is it's so exciting. You'll know this if you know me, through the screen in the last couple of years. How exciting it is to find a letter that sums up something you normally read about in books or in, you have in your wider consciousness. And this is a letter written by the estate factor to Miss Fraser describing the moment the Lovat Scouts departed for South Africa. The Scouts got a great send-off from here. I went to Southampton with the infantrymen. They sailed on the 10th in the Tintagel Castle. When I was south, I saw quite a number of troop ships leave, but there was nothing to equal the enthusiastic ovation the Scouts got. They were far and away the finest body of men that have left this country. Their outfit, too, was better in every way than the others. You will have heard of the disappointment and misfortune which overtook the mounted men. Between Glasgow and Southampton, a number of their horses took cold and pneumonia, the result being all were landed at Southampton and the ship fumigated. After staying there for a week, the Scouts hope to get away tomorrow or Thursday, the 22nd, leaving their horses to follow later. I was dreadfully sorry for this, especially as everything had gone without a hitch till then. And he finishes the letter to her by saying, all the people in the district are missing the Scouts very much. You can hear the local pride there. Now, William Theodore Fraser Tytler had been sent ahead to procure more horses. And again, in the Fraser Tytler collection, we hold a letter where he describes that arriving and waiting for the others to come. Now, in South Africa, the Scouts were a match for the Boers, and they soon found themselves developing an outstanding reputation. Even from those who had been sceptical and even scathing of them going, there was some mockery before they went about the idea of all these gillies and hillsmen going out to save the day. But they very quickly found themselves with a very strong reputation for their skills. And we hold in the Fraser Tytler collection papers detailing the Boer Wars and the Lovat Scouts' experiences by both William Theodore and Edward Grant Fraser Tytler, who are both officers. And both of them make reference in their correspondence to the reputation that the Scouts developed. So, for instance, in this extract, he goes on and says, once four of us rode out to round up some sheep which were rather nearer, and we turned fire on them, which at once shifted them. So they fire near the sheep run away. He says, I fancy even if fighting is over here, we will trek back to the Transvaal and we'll have more fighting there. Anyway, we are quite likely to be in any fighting that is going, as our men have made quite a name for themselves. Our colonel said to Will Blundell, I would sooner have Lovat Scouts than a brigade of cavalry. He heard another officer saying, Lovat's Scouts are the best mounted infantry we have. General Hunter also said that we had done more than our fair share of fighting and that he would report our services to Roberts. And there are lots of references to that, the reputation that the Scouts gathered for their ability. William Theodore Fraser Tytler wrote detailed letters to his mother describing his journey around South Africa and the sights that he saw. And I love the fact that in one of them, he starts it by saying to her, I'll tell you the exact route that I took because I know that you study the map. And I just thought that was a really interesting insight into all these people at home taking pride in the regiment, following the map, seeing where the Scouts are and what they're doing. There's also lots of references in these letters to the benefits of the very skills that the Scouts were recruited for. So, for instance, Edward Grant Fraser Tytler says, it takes long practice to spy ground properly with a telescope. Our hillsman can pick up a stag's horn a mile away in the heather and can even spy a whole hill without missing a single yard of it. He goes on to say, our telescopes are simply invaluable. I only wish every man had them. My telescope is very nearly as good as the large one the naval gunners have on a stand by their big guns. The field glasses they and their officers have are of little use, and also I can see that hardly any of them really understand spying. They could not understand how Ellis and I could follow every movement of our men at such a distance. One letter describes a night where the Boers attacked the camp, and one of the things that they were looking for, he records the words that one of the Boers says to them, that they're looking for those looking glasses that make you able to see us so well. So those exact skills that Lovat had identified were missing in the army, of the ability to spy, to stalk, to move through the landscape effectively. Those very things were what led to them having success. However, of course, in any war, a lot of what they were asked to do did not come easily to them and was a very uncomfortable and difficult thing. For instance, the rounding up of displaced Boer families into guarded camps, which would become known as concentration camps. Now, the Scouts had signed up for 1 year, and at the end of that time, the war was still ongoing. And Lord Lovat returned to Britain to raise a second contingent and later a third. On their arrival, the second and third contingents, many of the first returned home, and apparently only 4 of them had been killed in action, but the same would not be said of the second and third contingents. They had much less time for training and had far higher casualty numbers. But on their return, the first group of Lovat Scouts had a huge welcome in Inverness. If you have access to our website, Ambala, I'll put a link into the chat afterwards. There's a fantastic photo of the Lovat Scouts reception on their return to Inverness. They had a huge welcome in Bewley as well, and again there are details in the Lovat Estate collection about that. And when the second and third Lovat Scout contingents returned in August 1902, the Boer War having ended with the Treaty of Vereniging, which I may not have pronounced correctly, but you'll know the attempt was genuine. When the first, second, and third contingents of the Boer Scouts, the Lovat Scouts returned home. They had a huge, huge welcome in the Highlands. Interesting to note that in the treaty that ended the Boer War, the treaty terms included that the Boers would acknowledge King Edward VII as their monarch, and also that Britain would give £3 million towards rebuilding and restocking the farms and lands that had been destroyed. I'm conscious that that's me at 11:30, but I am going to go on a little bit longer, I'm afraid, because I know that many of you will be interested in the later story of the Scouts. Following the end of the Boer War, the Scouts were disbanded, but they were very soon reformed in a slightly different format, in which they existed training and attending camps until the outbreak of World War I. So they had, as the rest of the world did, really, that period of calm before the First World War. Now, World War I was, of course, to be an entirely different scale of war, a conflict bigger than any that had been seen before. And the Lovat Scouts would play their part in that. And once again, as they did in the Boer War, with their different set of skills and there being the first unit to wear a ghillie suit, in the First World War, they once again were the first to do various things. They stood slightly apart again. The Lovat Scouts fought at many of the worst theatres of World War I. They fought in the Western Front, in Gallipoli, Egypt, and Macedonia. And they, along with so many others, suffered intense hardship and loss, particularly at Gallipoli. And one of the key things that happened to the Lovat Scouts in World War I came in autumn 1916, and I've seen some people commenting about it already. And that was when a section of the Lovat Scouts were formed again by Lord Lovat, became the Lovat Scouts Sharpshooters, the British Army's first ever sniper unit. So again, a first from this unit that had had this sort of amazing formation with the vision of one man, went on again to become something unique and unusual in the First World War, becoming the first sniper unit. Now, Lord Lovat was initially in charge, and Donald Cameron of Lochiel took command of the Lovat Scouts Sharpshooters. And as you'll know, we hold the Lochiel papers in our Lochaber Archive Centre, including correspondence from this time. The book that I've referred to, The Story of the Lovat Scouts, records that of the men who formed the original first 10 groups of the Lovat Scouts Sharpshooters, 1 out of every 5 was awarded a military decoration. It goes on to say that the names of the 481 Lovat Scouts who lost their lives in the First World War are recorded in the Roll of Honour at the Scottish National War Memorial in Edinburgh Castle. Their supreme sacrifice continues to be well remembered in the Highlands. So you can see that that pride that the Highlands had during the Boer War in the Lovat Scouts continued in the First World War, a real pride in this local section of the army and what they were achieving. And the fact that 1 in every 5 of them was awarded a military decoration is quite extraordinary, I think. Now, as had happened after the Boer War, at the end of the First World War, the Lovat Scouts saw a reduction. They continued with a regiment, I think a regiment and 3 squadrons across the Highlands, which trained at camps and met throughout the interwar years again. Now, in February 1933, Lord Lovat died very suddenly. Of course, he had contributed a huge amount in the country and in the local area in various ways, but he remains most strongly associated with the Lovat Scouts, for which he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, Companionship of the Bath, and the KCMG, amongst all of those other honours that I mentioned at the beginning. And I was reading some of his obituaries when I was preparing for this. You can see them on the British Newspaper Archive website. And they list all the extraordinary things that Lovat had done. But one of the things that it mentions is the fact that at the funeral, the Lovat Scouts provided a guard of honour. Now, of course, the Lovat Scouts didn't die with Lord Lovat in 1933. And of course, the world was to be thrown shortly after that into another global conflict. And World War II saw the Lovat Scouts providing the garrison for the Faroe Isles, where they provided, as I say, a garrison, and they stayed there from May 1940 to June 1942, protecting the Faroe Islands, which were of great strategic importance in the North Atlantic. Now, this role in garrisoning the Faroes mainly involved patrolling, but it's really maybe completely classic of any kind of people with military training, but they took this opportunity to train extensively. So while they were in the Faroes, they did drill practice, they did fieldcraft, sniper practice, observation, spying, map reading, signalling, and many other things. And in addition, they spent the time supporting the Royal Navy with the situation in the North Atlantic. They took care of survivors who ended up on their shores. They boarded alien ships and they detonated the mines which had broken free from their moorings in the North Atlantic. They used that as target practice, so they would stand on the headland in the Faroe Islands, and as these mines broke free and they were alerted to them, they would detonate them through sniper fire. So using that as practice as well. When they left the Faroe Islands in June 1942, they were replaced by the Cameronians. The Scouts were briefly based back in the UK. They trained in the mountains of Scotland and North Wales before going to Canada for intensive winter training in skiing and other related winter skills. The training was very deliberately harsh, and again, we hold letters in our Lochiel collection that talk about the time in Canada. The training was deliberately harsh and winter focused because many of the Scouts were next sent to Italy, where they stayed from the middle of 1944 until the end of the war. And this again was a very hard time for the Scouts. They had many losses, and a number of gallantry awards were again allocated or awarded to members of the Lovat Scouts. Now, post-World War II, the Lovat Scouts were again disbanded and reformed, just as they had been after the Boer War and after the First World War. And as I say, like any military unit or regiment or battalion, they have undergone numerous changes ever since. So that takes us to 1945, the end of the Second World War. Now, at Lochaber Archive Centre, one of the other things that we hold, and again it's within the Cameron of Lochiel collection, are the records of the Lovat Scouts Regimental Association from 1945 to 1986, which include minutes, correspondence, constitution and rules, and various other items. Those records also include correspondence with Major Michael Leslie Melville, who wrote the book that I referred to, The Story of the Lovat Scouts. And there are references within that collection to the writing of this book. And incidentally, one of those who sanctioned the book when it was published in 1981 was the son of the Lovat Scouts founder, the next Lord Lovat, who had also served with huge distinction in the Lovat Scouts in World War II. He's mentioned in Churchill's biography of World War II. And if you're interested in military history at all, I would recommend looking at almost any member of the Lovat, the Frasers. They're quite extraordinary. Now, most recently, in its recent history, the name Lovat Scouts has been associated with the Orkney Independent Cadet Battery, the Lovat Scouts, who amalgamated with their Shetland equivalent in 2018, but I believe they still retain the cap badge of the Lovat Scouts. And I believe also that they remain very proud of their connection with the legacy and the history of the Scouts. I'm aware I have run over ever so slightly, but hopefully you'll forgive me. It's a huge amount to cram into half an hour, so I hope that I've got some of that story over and you've enjoyed it. Thank you for joining me. I hope you can join me next week. Next week will be pre-recorded because I'm on leave, which is very exciting. So the next week I will be looking at Dunray and the Atomics and the movement of people who came to Caithness to work in Dunray when it opened. If you're in the area of Inverness or the Highlands, the other thing I would flag to you is we've got an event coming up on the 3rd of May with a local historical writer, Jennifer Morag Henderson. She'll be hosting an event at the Archive Centre looking at how she uses archives in writing her books. If you are interested in coming along to that, then please do. It's a free event, bookable on Eventbrite, and Jennifer and I will look forward to seeing you at that. But thank you again for your time, and I will. You'll see me next week, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. But a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. If you're able to donate towards our work, then we very much appreciate that. Thank you.